Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most up-to-date issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. With less than 2 weeks until South Korea's June 3rd presidential election, overseas voters are poised to play a critical role. Ballots are being cast in 223 locations across 118 countries worldwide, with over 258,000 Koreans registering to cast their votes. Now, this is a significant jump compared to the last election, despite the fact that this year's overseas voting process had the shortest preparation window since its inception. And with compressed timelines, logistical challenges, and major policy stakes in play, the overseas vote is proving to be far more than symbolic. Today, we examine what's truly at stake, not just for Koreans at home, but also for the global electorate that's ready to be heard. For this, we are joined in the studio by Hans Shadow, Professor of Political Science at Yonsei University with us. Welcome, Professor.
Hi, Mok-yeon. Nice to see you.
Great to see you, too. And also joining us online is Daniel Han, counselor for the City of Ryde in Sydney, and an active leader in Australia's Korean community as well. Great to see you.
Hello, thanks for having me again.
Thank you for joining us. Let's begin our discussion with Professor Shadow. So this overseas voter registration, I said it reached 258,000, more than 258,200 this year, which is a 14.2% jump from the last presidential election. Could you tell us how significant is this figure in terms of electoral impact? You know, specifically given that the last presidential race was decided by just, 240,000 votes.
That's right, Mok-yeon. And the last presidential election, of course, was remarkably close, basically less than a percentage point. So I suppose it's not very likely that this time around the two candidates will end up with that narrow a margin, but you never know. It ain't over until it's over. And one pattern that we have seen since overseas voting began for Korea with the 2012 presidential election is that the voters who participate generally lean a little bit more toward the Democratic Party than the Conservative Party. So if we go back to 2012, the overseas voters rewarded Moon Jae-in that time around. He had, I believe, about 56% of the vote. And in 2022, when it was Lee Jae-myung against Yoon Suk-yeol, Lee had 59% of the vote, and Yoon only had 36%. So it was a closer result in 2022 because the overseas voters were participating. Without those overseas voters, Yoon would have won by a wider margin. So now we have more overseas voters participating. Again, past behavior doesn't necessarily predict the future here, but it would suggest that these voters will also lean somewhat in the direction of the DP. And again, even though we have 10 days before the election, the polls show Lee Jae-myung still with a fairly sizable lead. That lead is narrowing, and if the lead continues to narrow going into the election day, the overseas voters could be all the more important. So they could end up, figuring in one way or the other to how we analyze the outcome in a little over 10 days.
Right, so it seems like it's not really a small number considering the circumstances. Let's also bring in Councillor Han to the discussion too. So, Councillor, since you're in Sydney right now, could you tell us what does the current voting atmosphere look like in Australia, and what's your prediction for voter turnout among Koreans in this election?
Well, I think Korean Australians in Sydney are more engaged than ever in this year's election. There are a couple of reasons to this, I think. The lead up to this election, there's been a series of events that really grabbed everyone's attention around the world, especially all of the Koreans around the world has been following the saga very closely. And secondly, for Australia, we've just had our own federal election, which is equivalent to the presidential election in Korea. So politics, wherever you go, whether you're in the Korean politics or whether you're talking about Australian politics, it's been the hot topic of the town, whether it's from workplace to any dinner parties. And that's why I'm expecting a very strong voter turnout in general, but also in Australia.
Right. So a lot of attention is focused on this coming elections. Now, Counselor, we've heard that you lived in Australia since middle school and you served the community as a pharmacist, a teacher, and now an elected official. Given these experiences, do you think there's something very specific about the local culture or context in Australia that encourages such consistency in higher vote out turnout among Korean residents?
Yes, Australia is a very unique country. Now, Australia has one of the highest voter turnouts in the world. To put it into context, we average around 90% or 90 or above participation rate, compared to the US or Korea, where they sit around 60 to 70%. Now, this political atmosphere may have an effect on the Korean voters in Australia. And there is a reason for such high voter turnout in Australia, because voting is actually compulsory here. So there are only a handful of countries around the world that promote compulsory voting, but we go the extra mile to actually enforce this. So, which means if you don't vote or if you forget to vote, you get fined. You get fined between about $50 US to about $100 US. Now, it's debatable whether enforcing people to vote and penalizing them is impinging on their freedom of their rights. But I think this way, being able to participate in voting, I think it's an important right as a citizen, but it comes with a very important responsibility that shapes the future of a nation. So enforcing, I think this is probably the best democracy, I think. And I'm a big fan of Australian electoral system, and I'm very proud of it as well. I'd like to introduce one more very unique characteristic that is different to the Korean electoral system. We have what you call preferential voting system. This means on the ballot paper, you don't just choose one candidate, you actually rank them. You rank them the way you like them. So your top choice, if your top choice doesn't win, your votes will still count towards your next preference. So your voting intention is never wasted. And this actually, I think it empowers people. So if you put it into the current Korean situation, Korean election situation at the moment, there's been many talks of 단일화, the merger of parties, right? And I just heard Lee Jun-seok rejected the merger. Now, people don't really have a say in the mergers, really, but using this preferential system, each individual decides who they would prefer, and if their candidate doesn't make it, so hypothetically, if I'm a Lee Jun-seok voter, right, I vote Lee Jun-seok, and then for my second preference, I can put one of the other candidates. And if Lee Jun-seok doesn't make it, my vote goes to either Lee Jae-myung or Kim Won-soo, and that adds to their votes. And interestingly, this way, at the end of the election, you actually get to know how many of Lee Jun-seok's votes go to Lee Jae-myung, or how many goes to Kim Won-soo. So that's a very interesting data politically, if you that you can find out if you have this system. So it's very interesting. Maybe when the time comes for Korea to discuss electoral system reform, they could have a good look at our system here.
Wow, so it's really interesting. So making it mandatory to vote and having a preferential voting system could really help look into, who they really vote for and who they really prefer, actually. So it would be definitely helpful and helping them exercise their right to vote. Now, Professor Shuttle, how has this overseas voting historically influenced the outcome of the presidential elections in general? Are there any specific instances where, this overseas vote played a decisive or a symbolic role?
Well, it came pretty close in 2022, as we discussed just a moment ago. Less so in 2017, when Moon Jae-in won overwhelmingly. That time around, the overseas vote was pretty much in line with the country as a whole. And then in, of course, 2012, which was the first time of the overseas voting, Park Geun-hye won despite the overseas voting favoring Moon. But, you know, picking up on what Mayor Han was just saying about ranked choice voting, I thoroughly agree. And I think there's some relevance here for overseas voters, too. First of all, ranked choice, if and when Korea ever does talk about electoral reform, it does provide some refinement and gives voters who choose the candidates who initially get ruled out another way of still influencing the election after those first choices lose. Overseas voters in particular, right now, are expressing frustration that if they vote for the minority party candidates, those votes become wasted if they don't win. In fact, Lee Jun-sok, for instance, I've read some news coverage where voters in Germany, I believe, who would consider voting for him are not voting for him because they worry that if he were to drop out, then that vote gets eliminated and it's a wasted vote. Whereas if you have ranked choice, then you vote for that person, he loses, while you still have the second choice going into play. And for overseas voters that are showing up several days before the election, the possibility that the person that they vote for will drop out is not hypothetical. It could really happen. Unlike some other countries that sometimes will have the overseas voting on the day of the election, Korea has it over a period of days, but it's in advance of the actual election day. So voters have to go in and they have to guess whether or not, if they support a minority candidate, whether that candidate will still be in the picture when the final election day comes in. And ranked choice would soften that calculation a little bit if we had it.
Right, so it would be definitely helpful, especially in this current situation where we're expecting or not expecting a merger. Now, this election had the shortest preparation period for overseas voting since the system's introduction, because it's a snap election, of course. Have logistical preparations for this short notice overseas election presented any specific challenges for Korean voters in Australia? Councillor Han?
This time around, we're not facing any major issues. I remember the last time when we had last Korean election here, it fell during the public holiday period in Australia. So that made it tough for some people who had travel plans and who couldn't vote away from the city. But this time around, the timing is much better. I think more people are ready to exercise their democratic rights of the politics that they've been following very closely. So I'm expecting one of the highest overseas voter turnouts in Australia and around the world.
Right, it's quite impressive, to see, even though this short timeline, people are still like working and struggling and making efforts to cast their ballots, like we've been seeing in the news lately. Now, what about Professor Shuttle in general? Then, what kind of challenges or vulnerabilities might this short preparatory time present in terms of transparency or voter access or even security?
Well, as we were saying earlier, there are a couple of hundred Korean embassies and consulates around the world that have to get their houses in order to accommodate the overseas voters coming in. And I've actually seen the process up close. During the 2022 presidential election, a couple of weeks before that took place, I was actually back home in Boston, and I happened to go to the Korean consulate to sort out a visa. And turned out they were having the early overseas voting at that moment in time. Consulate was full of people coming in to vote and having all their identification documents and papers ready. I would compare it more to early voting in the U.S. Many cities and towns in the U.S., especially since COVID, are now allowing voters to show up before the actual election day and cast their ballots. Really, the key is to make sure that you have the same sorts of transparent and secure procedures throughout the duration of the early voting that you would have on the election day itself. So it's very important for the voters to have proper identification, especially with overseas voting. That can involve bringing in passports and the like, or citizenship documents and ID cards and so forth. It's also, personally, I think it's important to have paper ballots. As I understand it, that's how the overseas voting works here. So if there's any need to recount or double check the veracity of votes, that those paper ballots are kept. The U.S. went through a period when I was growing up that they were using electronic voting machines and also just mechanical voting machines for a time. That gave way to paper ballots because of the concern about transparency and security. At this point, I think, I'm not witnessing the process firsthand, but the consulates, this is now their fourth presidential election with overseas voting, and I think there are pretty well standardized procedures in place. And as long as the individual offices stick to those procedures, then I think that can lend some confidence to the credibility of the overseas votes.
Now, let's step aside a little bit from voter turnout and move to policies. Councillor Han, what kind of policy expectations do overseas Koreans typically have, and how well are today's presidential candidates addressing these diaspora-specific issues?
Well, I haven't heard any particular policy regarding overseas Koreans from any candidates so far. But over the years, I've been speaking to many overseas Koreans. And at the heart of it all, I think what they really want is to be fully included and involved in shaping Korea's future, no matter where they live in the world. So two of the main points that I hear a lot from the communities is easier access to voting and even possibly having dedicated seats or representation in the Korean parliament for overseas Koreans. And another issue is the right to return and settle in Korea, like reverse immigration, with proper support like education and health. And I think this could be a key solution to the decreasing population in Korea because so many Koreans live abroad and they still identify themselves as Koreans. And if it is much easier, it becomes easier to return to Korea and resettle in Korea, I think it could be one of the solutions. We can't solve all the problems in the world, but we can talk about some ideas.
Let's hope those ideas could be really heard and put into action as well. Now, Councillor, you've mentioned that there was an Australian federal election held on May 3rd. And what kind of lessons do you think could be drawn from that election, especially regarding global political currents or political parallels to Korea's political climate?
Well, yes, our federal election here in Australia was a big moment. The coalition, which is our more conservative party, they've been leading the polls closer to the election, but then ended up losing, had a thumping, like losing. The other party had a landslide win. So, and the same thing I think happened in Canada last month. And I think one of the reasons or the factors was the growing uncertainty around the global economy made the voters very risk averse, and they didn't want anything to do with conservative parties or the right-wing parties. And the left have managed to capitalize the fear very well here, and people have responded with their ballot papers. So yes, as for the Korean election, the global political currents will be unavoidable, but I hope this election can be a chance to debate about real solutions, good policies, and a clear vision for the future, rather than a fear-driven smearing campaigns.
Right. Now, before we conclude our discussion tonight, Professor Shuttle, looking ahead to the election day, what do you think is ultimately at stake in this presidential election, not just for Koreans at home, but also for the millions of overseas Koreans watching and voting from abroad?
Right. I think number one might very well be the integrity of the country's constitutional democracy. We cleared one phase with the Constitutional Court decision that removed former President Yoon from power. And I think many voters at home, and especially overseas, want to see the country clear the next hurdle with a smooth presidential election and a peaceful transfer of power to whomever might be the next president. I think there will also be a lot of concern going forward that the next president can maintain integrity while serving for the duration, that hopefully impeachment will not be needed again. The country's gone through 2 impeachments in the last 10 years, and I cannot say enough how much I think the public would like to avoid going through something like that again. And then, of course, there's a whole host of serious issues as well. Inequality, education, housing, affordability. These are issues that the 2 political parties are not necessarily so far apart on in their policies, yet they seem to find it difficulty to reach consensus as to where to take the country. And then you layer in all the geopolitical situations. The new president will have a lot to work with. Last thing I'll say is the overseas voters really pay attention. I was reading some testimony from some of them interviewed by reporters, particularly in Europe. People are watching the debates. There's been one debate so far that got a lot of attention, and I saw quotes from voters saying that they were not satisfied with what the candidates were saying about the anti-discrimination law. And in fact, one voter, I think in particular, wanted to support candidate Kwon Young-guk, and because they thought he came across stronger on that particular issue. So the voters are paying attention to very specific and detailed issues that might not affect them directly, but might say a lot about the direction the country is taking, and it weighs into their choices.
So it's a reminder that vote isn't just about policy, it's also about direction as well.
For sure.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and for your insights tonight. Professor Shadow, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Mok-yeon.
Thank you too. And Councillor Han, we appreciate your insights and your time tonight.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.